The First Wave, JBJ, Chiam, and the Opposition in Singapore by Loke Hoe Yeong. Introduction. Democratisation has been described to occur in waves rather than as sudden bolts, as would be ascribed to political revolutions, for instance. The first wave of a democratic awakening in post-independence Singapore did start, though, with the bolt of JB Jeyaretnam's surprise victory, or for the People's Action Party (PAP), a shock defeat, in the Anson by-election of 1981. Only one general election before that in 1980, the ruling PAP was still looking at a share of 75.6% of the popular vote with zero representation in parliament from the opposition. Nevertheless, the momentum of opposition growth in Singapore built up gradually through to the 1984 general election, the first of many elections in Singapore to be called a watershed, in which Chiam See Tong was also elected in Potong Pasir. After the 1991 general election, and with a record 4 members in parliament, the opposition began dreaming of forming the government one day. But their euphoria was short-lived. After all, the use of the wave analogy also implies an element of ebb and flow. Almost immediately after the opposition victories of 1991, fault lines in the leading Singapore Democratic Party, SDP, rose to the surface, and the party was wiped out of parliament in 1997. The opposition, as fronted by Chiam, spent the next decade thereafter experimenting with coalition arrangements among themselves. But it was not until the 2011 general election that the Workers' Party, led by its new leader Loke Hoe Yeong, would make more substantial gains for the opposition. What went wrong with the first generation of Singapore's post-independence opposition? This book examines their rise and fall in the period from 1981 to 2011 with the aim of filling a gap in explanations of Singapore politics. Problematic explanations of Singapore's politics. The old adage that oppositions don't win elections, governments lose them, suggests incumbency is generally a liability for ruling parties. Although Singapore has always been known to be a sui generis case, there is a prevalence of muddled explanations as to why Singapore is that to such a great degree. One school of thought favours the PAP and credits the long-standing ruling party of Singapore for winning the hearts and minds of the electorate with their policies, which have brought stability and prosperity, and chastises the opposition for failing to get its act together. Meanwhile, the other school of thought sympathises with the opposition and blames the PAP for the unfair hurdles and barriers erected against it, such as laws and regulations that restrict funding and the avenues of communication for opposition parties, and for creating a climate of fear that discourages more credible opposition candidates from stepping forward. Sometimes, the latter group admits that Singaporeans have been willing to sacrifice some political freedoms in return for political economic stability. Writing in 1995, the sociologist Chua Beng Huat asserted that it should be obvious that the refrain of authoritarianism as the explanation of Singapore's political development in the past 3 decades is inadequate. His classic text, Communitarian Ideology and Democracy in Singapore, recognized a polarization that has characterized studies on Asian governments, which either concentrates on a history of authoritarian repression or unequivocally praises the regime. That situation remains unchanged in some quarters today. Outside of Singapore, observers and researchers from the media, academia, and non-governmental organizations tend to be aligned with the latter group. This resonates with the democracy indices by organizations like Freedom House and the Economist Intelligence Unit, which generally rank Singapore far down the list, setting it apart from its peers in the club of advanced economies. To be clear, this is not to be an apologist for repressive laws, just as it is inconceivable for Chua to be one. Important as they are, those critiques of the Singapore system belong to a different debate. In fixating themselves on Singapore's restrictions on political freedoms and civil liberties, these observers miss the opportunity to offer rigorous explanations on why things have
Sample complete. Ready to continue?